Really? Yeah.
Sri Aurobindo began the journey of his yoga without reference to any existing tradition. It was subsequent to his series of experiences that he turned to some of India's traditional texts to see if what they said corresponded to his experiences. And he discovered that in the most ancient and the most authoritative of the texts, in the Veda, he found that some of the highest experiences that he had touched were described there in great detail, almost matching his own. And it was then that he began to explore more deeply some of these texts. Subsequently, in 1914, when he began to write the Arya, he made that a part of one of the objectives of the Arya, to penetrate deep into some of the ancient texts in order to draw from them the precious truths necessary for the future of humanity, and to bring them forward to articulate them in terms of the modern human mind, which he said is a rational mind. These texts, Vedic and the early Upanishadic, were articulated by a mind which was not so much rational but much more intuitive, and in a language which could best formulate an intuitive experience. I'm tempted to digress here, and I will, but for the purpose of elucidating this. In the modern languages of the world, in English, for example, a word has a corresponding fixed meaning. So, when you say light, it means this. When you say dark, it means that. When you have an idea, a concept, it has a very specific correspondence. So when you look up a dictionary, you find each word is described in terms of a few other words. You can make a dictionary in English and a dictionary in French. And for most words, you will find an equivalence. This word means that in the other language. Occasionally you have words which don't have exact translations because the equivalent concept has not been given a word in this language. So you have to express it in terms of a more complex set of words. In German, for example, there are many words which have a very specific sense. Time spirit. What is the word in German? Zeitgeist. Zeitgeist. Literal translation would be time spirit. But it has a very specific connotation which is not carried by just these two words in English. It has a sense of something compelling. Compelling things to happen. Zeitgeist is a force of time working out things. It's not just spirit of time. And so a few words like that as exceptions. But when you look at the Sanskrit language, it's not so simple. A word may have multiple meanings depending on context. It's actually not so complicated when you experience it, but when it's told like that, it sounds weird. And so when you look at a Sanskrit to English dictionary, you'll find one word in Sanskrit with many corresponding English terms. or one word in English having many possible Sanskrit terms, depending on how that word is being used and in its context. And now that makes for a bit of a complication. The English Sanskrit dictionary would be that fat, when an English French dictionary would be 1/10 or at least 1/8 or 1/5 in the size. Interestingly, also, in the Sanskrit dictionary, the shorter the word is, the longer its explanations. The longer the word is, the shorter its equivalence. And you wonder, what's this thing? And it has to do with the way the mind works, because language is an expression of the mind. And in the current rational languages, ideas, concepts have been broken into pieces. But in a consciousness that sees continuity, you cannot cut up ideas into pieces, because there's always a continuity of a context, and there's always a continuity from one point of idea to another point, with many in between ideas. And so you cannot simply cut up pieces and make simple equivalences. The intuitive mind also, when it looks at the flower, it sees flower experience on many levels. There is the whole experience of flowerness of the rose, but then there are also dimensions to it, suggestions and deeper nuances, which just one word rose would not capture. And those also need to be somehow expressed, because the mind is looking at them, perceiving them. And so in the Sanskrit language, the starting point is different from the starting point of the modern rational languages. In the English language, for example, you start with a blank slate, and as you speak the words, you are constructing a specific thought. At the end of the sentence, that thought is completed. But in the Sanskrit language, the starting point is not a blank slate. It's as if everything is present. There is the Brahman, and the totality of all possibilities is there. And as you speak, you are narrowing the focus until at the end you settle upon a particular idea, thought, which then is always seen at the backdrop of all the rest. And so the vocabulary itself moves like this. One sound stated, there is a narrowing. A second sound added, a further narrowing. And a third sound makes for a further narrowing. This is the reason why in the Sanskrit dictionary, the shorter the word, the longer its explanation, because it still includes a much larger chunk of ideas and experiences. And as the word becomes longer, it narrows down until it limits itself to a small, specific, mental idea. The Vedic language, therefore, the Vedic Sanskrit, is much closer to this intuitive expression. And so a word spoken in the Veda is known not by its specific idea, thought, content, but by the suggestion of the series of root sounds that build the word. And the root sounds themselves are physical articulations of psychological or even spiritual experiences. Now, when, let's say, you don't have a language and you have to convey something with sound, what does the sound do? What is the sound that you actually use? You don't make some arbitrary sound. You make a sound that corresponds to the feeling of what you want to express. When a little child starts babbling, his sounds are very expressive, although they do not use a conventional language. You hear the sound and you know what he's saying. That's how language originates. There's a feeling and experience, and then the vibration which corresponds closest to it becomes now its expression. And that's how the root sounds emerge. And Sanskrit is formed in this way. And so in the Veda, Sri Aurobindo found, as he was reading, the use of the words was much more profound. It did not correspond to a rationalized mind, but to the intuitive mind. And the suggestions used were deep and often multifaceted and multi-layered. And one had to understand the Veda in this sense. Now, this is not a new idea. In the Vedic tradition itself, it is described that the Veda can be understood on many levels. They in fact describe 3 levels on which it can be understood. The 3 words used, Adi Bhautik, Adi Daivik, Adhyatmik. The bhautik is bhuta in the most material formed domain. You can understand the text. In the domain of the elements, 5 elements which form substance and form. The Daivik, Daiva is in the domain of the divinities, the gods, deities, psychological and cosmic forces. You can understand it on that level. And Adi Atmik, in the domain of Atman, in the domain of the self, the consciousness of oneness, that you can understand the same text. So it is actually stated in so many words that you can understand on all these 3 levels the same text. And Sanskrit lends itself naturally, because of its structure of root sounds, to multiple levels of interpretation. Now, again, this is a strange idea for people who are used to the more mentalized, rationalized languages. But just to give an example of the flexibility, we had a very beautiful presentation a couple of years ago by Dr. Sampadananda Mishra on the flexibility and power of the Sanskrit language. But there you find, for example, in certain verses, the same verse can have multiple meanings, but the same verse forward has one meaning, backwards has another meaning, and when the letters are converted to numbers, you get pi to the 32nd decimal place. Forward is a prayer to Vishnu, backwards a prayer to Shiva, and you have pi. This kind of thing is easily done, relatively speaking, in the Sanskrit language. In the monks of various traditions, in the Jain tradition especially, used to play with this as a form of meditation. And they would write sentences which had multiple meanings. And one of the greatest is said to be a text, a whole paragraph written in Sanskrit, which has 24 different meanings. Each of the meanings is the life of one of the saints of the Jain tradition. How do you actually manage to do that? You cannot do it in a language which has been rationalized. You can only do it with a language which has this intuitive structure and the root sound structure still intact. Well, if this is possible in Sanskrit language, then imagine what the Vedic text could contain potentially. I've seen a newspaper item dated 1895 where a Marathi scholar by the name of Tarpade built a flying machine based on an interpretation of a verse in the Veda, which is a verse addressed to the sun. Aditya Hridayam is the name of that verse. And he understood that in terms of a mechanical device, a machine, based on which he built the machine that flew. This was a few years before the Wright brothers. And this was flown on the Bombay shores where the king of the region watched it and all the big officials watched it. And it appeared in the newspaper. The thing is still intact today for verification. But just to say that the same verse could have multiple levels of interpretation and they would correspond naturally to the multiple levels of creation, where a single truth in the origin resonates and manifests through these levels, in each articulating itself uniquely, distinctly, but in a continuity. And it's as if the language is able to catch this multiple levels of expression. I'm giving this whole background, I said it's a digression, because it helps us to understand how the Vedas can convey what they do convey. Every tradition in India, whether of spirituality, philosophy, art, science, mathematics, astronomy, astrology, each starts by stating its authority as the Veda. So you wonder, how can that be possible? And here you get a glimpse of how it could be possible. Well, Sri Aurobindo, entering the exploration of the Vedic texts, not only discovered the spiritual correspondences, but also some of these insights, some of which he makes reference to in a few texts, but then he concentrates primarily on the spiritual content of these experiences of the Vedic rishis. And so in the Arya, you find his series of articles called The Secret of the Veda. At the same time, he writes a commentary on the Isha Upanishad and then the Kena Upanishad and so on. And in all these, we see paralleling his development of the life divine and the synthesis of yoga, paralleling with the content of the Vedic texts, and you see exact correspondences in these ideas. In particular, the concept of the supermind. In the Veda, it is symbolized and represented by the symbol of the sun. And the sun itself has many names. For those of you who do Surya Namaskars, you will remember 12 names of the sun, each capturing a certain aspect, distinct, unique. But the sun is the physical symbol of the supramental sun. In other words, when you experience the supramental consciousness, it has this character of golden illumination of oneness. But it has also this sense of multiple facets in which it can express, and then from it is spreading out. The word Surya, which is one of the names of the sun, is the spreading out movement, spreading out into manifestation, into multiplicity. And in the spreading out are the rays. And the rays represent the sun itself and the body of the sun, now projecting a narrow, thin, finite ray. And each ray is unique in its direction. No two rays cross each other ever. They're all in perfect harmony, perfect alignment with each other, each representing something unique. Between any two rays are an infinity of rays, each unique, each distinct, none ever crossing. You can see how this is a movement symbolizing the full manifestation of perfect harmony, uniqueness, distinctness, oneness and continuity, and yet multiplicity and distinctness. In the symbol of the Veda, it's not merely a symbol, it's a living experience, but in our mind we have to see it as a symbol now. The rays, each of these rays now distinctly represent the illuminations of intuition. We discussed this morning the various levels of consciousness. The supermind, which holds the totality of the unity, as it turns into multiple facets, we call it the overmind, and then from there, when it reduces itself to a finite glimpse, a finite flash, a ray of the sun, of the supramental consciousness, we call it intuition. And up to there, you have the continuity of knowledge without error, but not finite, limited. After that, it's as if the ray starts deflecting, reflecting in the material of the mind, in the gradations it passes. And so you have a diffused light in the illumined mind, not the clear ray, but a diffused light. And then from there, a further division until in the domain of the mind, you see only distinct points, distinct ideas and things which you can put in conflict with each other. But the full light of the supermind has been broken up, fragmented, and is seen as in reflected waters where the waters are shaking. The sun above rising and the waters below shaking, you know what happens? The light flashes. And you see a flash, your eye turns to catch it, by the time you turn it's gone and something else flashes. And you look for it and it's gone, something else flashes. And this is our experience of the world in the mental consciousness. It looked like I caught the truth, but by the time I could grasp it, it's gone from my hands. And something else flashes, and it attracts, and this might be it, and I rush and I lose it. And something else, and something else. And our human life is full of a chase, looking for the truth, looking for the touch of that reality which we are seeking in our highest aspirations. And it seems like each moment something might promise it, might get it, and we lose it. And we're always running zigzag, zigzag, the crooked path as described by the Veda. But behind that, the reality is an illumination which is clear, straight, free. And so in the Isha Upanishad, the last verse says, invoking Agni, the divine will, the fire of aspiration, the psychic presence within us. It says, lead us through the straight path. Lead us away from the crooked path to the straight path. It's a concept which you will find in many traditions. The same similar vocabulary also is interestingly existing in the Quran. This idea of the crooked path and the straight path is represented by the mother in a very beautiful picture when her great grandson asked her, Mother, he was in the ashram school, very young, Mother, what is yoga? And so she took a piece of paper and a pen, drew a little dot below and a square above, and drew a line going zigzag, widening and then again narrowing until it settled on the square. And she said, This is the normal life. And then she drew a straight line from this circle to the square and said, This is yoga. Very simple. We're going to get there anyway. You go through the crooked path, drifting along, wandering. It's very symbolic, the picture. Initially, you start with a small movement because your consciousness is small, you're incapable. And the first part of the journey of the soul is the widening of your capacities, widening of your nature, developing your faculties and powers. And so the path becomes wider and wider, covering more and more the possibilities of the human experience. Once you've sufficiently enriched and built up all your equipment to experience life and to manifest and express a rich life, then there's a prioritizing. Now, what's important? What's more important? What's essential? And there's a kind of a narrowing to focus upon that. But your consciousness is focusing upon what's important, but your capacities are expressing that more and more richly because you've built the base of richness. And culminating in the square at the top, which symbolizes, by the way, the supermind. This is also the same symbol of a normal human life. As a child, you start with this little movement which widens, and there's a point where you reach, often in the early 30s, where you say, okay, now what? I need to focus on what's more important, and there is gradually narrowing, and so on. So this symbol in the Veda is very powerful. There is the Agni, the divine will, which incidentally is also a representation of the sun, the truth, but put out into manifestation and working from below, from within the inconscious to build forms which can inhabit the various deities. And so the whole journey of the human soul is Agni rising up, growing, developing his own personality. And as a flame, it is at first a darkened flame, covered up, and then growing. It becomes a smoky flame, giving off smoke that is in the emotional domains, where you feel something intensely, but your emotion itself consumes you and burns you, and then awakens to clear light, where its light is evident to itself in the domain of the mind. And then from there, the journey takes a different turn as it rises above mind, all the way to its own home, Svedame, in the domain of Supermind. And so there are many such symbols in the Veda. The sun is central to this whole thing as the supramental consciousness and its working. In the Kena Upanishad, for example, which is a direct formulation from the Vedic verses, a selection from the Vedic verses, you have this idea of the sun, where many names are used to describe various aspects and functions of the supramental consciousness. One of the verses goes like this: Pushan Ekarshe Yama Surya Prajapatya. All of these are names of the sun. One who is the powerful, the power, the omnipotence aspect. The one who sees the oneness, seer of oneness, one who holds the oneness. The one who holds the law, the right relation of things, the laws by which everything is held in perfect harmony. The one who spreads into manifestation. The one who stands above as Lord and Master of the whole manifestation. And these are the 5 terms used to describe. And then it invokes the sun in this way and then says, Vyuha Rashmin Samuha. That is, put all the rays in perfect alignment and draw them into the oneness. If you see what this symbolizes, remember each ray represents a glimpse. And all these glimpses, let's use the word ideas, concepts, even thoughts, in all of our thoughts which are in chaos, in a disarray, place them in perfect alignment, in perfect harmony with each other. And having placed them in perfect harmony, now suddenly everything is part of a continuity. They are no more contradicting each other, like the rays of the sun which never cross each other. And then draw them together into their oneness. And it's as if all the thoughts, all the concepts, all the ideas we can have, when perfectly aligned, they move together in phalanxes, like marching soldiers merging into the oneness. They all point to the same origin, the same oneness, and lead us into the same one truth, whatever your starting point in the multiplicity. All of these, I'm just giving a glimpse, it's not meant to be a comprehensive presentation, but all of these descriptions you find perfectly aligning with the experience of the supermind and its role and function in the sadhana, in the yoga. In Sri Aurobindo's commentary here elaborates on all these and putting them in context of the vocabulary that he uses in the English language for the yoga. Now, there's one important problem though. The word used for supermind, vijnana, V means specifically with a special emphasis. Jnana, knowledge of oneness. Vijnana is the term used, and it is described as Satyam, Ritam, Brihat, the truth, the right, the vast. Now, by no means can this be used as a description of the intellect, right? The truth, consciousness, the rightness, the vastness. And yet, in the later articulations of the Vedic texts, this Vijnana was translated as the intellect. And to this day, you will find in many of the existing Vedic traditions and in many of the Vedantic teachings, they will translate Vijnana as intellect, which would be not a complete error because the intellect can be seen as a reflection of the supermind in the domain of the mind. But this is the point. It is not the truth, the right, the vast. And so that function, which is of the supermind in the whole working of the cosmos, has suddenly been removed. And instead, the intellect, which is a fragmented consciousness, wandering in confusion, in ignorance, is suddenly given a preeminent position. And what happens then? There is a huge gap between the human life experience and the divine consciousness above. The linking principle which links the Satchidananda above, the divine consciousness and in its oneness, from the multiplicity and the ignorance below, that linking principle of supermind has been removed. Instead, the intellect has been highlighted. And the intellect, well, you don't know what's true. You're always struggling. And the result is that the journey of yoga itself is seen as a great leap from the intellect to the self, with no link in between. Life itself, therefore, and the multiplicity of life and the ignorance which comes with it, is discarded, therefore, as not compatible with the self. Illusory or a domain of suffering, whatever the specific form it may take. This has been one of the great problems of the subsequent period in which the supermind was misrepresented or reduced to something which is secondary. Sri Aurobindo brings back the proper utilization of this term and brings back this principle which links the higher and the lower and makes for possibility not only for a continuous ascent into the divine consciousness, but a continuous descent of the divine into the mind, life and body, making possible, enabling the possibility of a divine life upon earth. So this is an important background to keep in mind, especially for those of you who will look at those texts or those teachings. But with this background now, we explore in what way the Upanishads, and particularly I will touch upon the Kena Upanishad, presents to us an approach to the supermind. In the Kena, there's a Very interesting idea. It starts with a question. By whom missioned falls the mind shot to its mark? By whom yoked moves the first life breath forward on its paths? By whom impelled is this word that men speak? What God set eye and ear to their workings? And then the next verse says, that which is hearing of our hearing, mind of our mind, speech of our speech, that too is life of our life breath and sight of our sight, that the wise are released beyond and they pass from this world and become immortal. There, sight travels not, nor speech, nor the mind. We know it not, nor can distinguish how we should teach of it. For it is other than the known. It is there above the unknown. It is so we have heard from men of old who declared that to our understanding. So here is a question asked and then an answer given. What is it that moves the mind to its mark? The mind of our mind. Who moves the life breath forward on its path? The life of our life. Who impels the word? Speech of our speech. And what sets the eyes and ears to their working? Which deity? The sight of our sight and hearing of our hearing. Now here comes a very interesting idea that all of our current key functions which make possible our human mental life, power of thought, power of speech or expression or creativity, power of the senses and the life itself that we live, are all possible because of something above equivalent to them, but which is their origin. But that above is something so different that our sight, speech, or mind cannot reach it. And it is other than the known. And if you attain to that, you are released from ignorance and live in immortality, in the consciousness of oneness. And then it proceeds to teach you about it. Having said that we do not know how to teach of it, it proceeds to teach you about it. That which is unexpressed by the word, that by which the word is expressed. Know that to be the Brahman and not this which men follow after here. What is it by which the word is expressed? What makes the word capable of conveying knowledge, experience, power? That is Brahman. That which thinks not by the mind, that by which the mind is thought. Know that to be the Brahman and not this which men follow after here. So there's a consciousness which is not mental, which doesn't have to think out, but it is the cause of the formation of the mind and its working. That is Brahman. And so with the hearing, and so with the sight, and so with the life breath. And it is this which Sri Aurobindo now uses to develop the idea of a consciousness greater, a supra-mental consciousness. And that's what the text is actually pointing to, if you read the rest of it, and we won't go into the technicalities of it. The important thing here is this idea that the supramental consciousness is not cut off from, but is the cause of all that we have. So think of it this way. How does your mind think? How does it work? Let's say, I take a very crude example. When you say, if this leads to that, and that leads to the other, then this leads to the other. Right? Very simple. How? If a child asks you, how do you say that? What will you say? How will you explain it? Just see, if this leads to that and that leads to the other, then the first has to lead to the third. It's obvious. The child says, how? Why should it? Come on, just think. It's obvious. You can't prove it beyond the fact of seeing that it's obvious. Right? There's no way you can convince somebody who cannot see it. And the question I would ask is, what is it in you that sees the obviousness of this? That which is seeing the obviousness is not thinking out the obviousness, it is seeing it. It's obvious. That's a function behind your rational mind. Because it is there, because it sees, your rational mind functions in this way. You see the point? You see certain things and it's obvious that it's like that because something behind is seeing.
Can you repeat that, please?
So, when you say A leads to B and B leads to C, it's obvious A leads to C, right? But if I ask, prove it, you can't. You either see it or you don't see it. So this thing in you that sees it, it does not need any thinking process. It's seeing it, it's obvious, right? The thinking process is saying if A leads to B, B leads to C, therefore A leads to C. That's your thinking mind. But there's a seeing mind behind which sees the truth of it, which makes possible your power of thinking. Understand? And that does not need to think. Sorry, you have to shake your head, but you see the beauty of it. The whole functioning of the rational mind and its thought process is possible because there's something behind which sees, obviously. And the way it sees defines the way our rational mind works. It casts, it makes possible the working of our rational mind.
Something says this makes sense. At some point it may say, oh, this does not make sense.
Right. So when you say something makes sense, I say, I didn't understand what you said, repeat it. And then when you repeat it, something in you clicks and you say, I got it now. The part where you got it had nothing to do with your thinking process. It had to do with the seeing consciousness, which saw, now I see it. Right? It doesn't matter how much you thought around. It's not a complex maze you have to wander in. You see, and it's obvious.
What if you get from A, you cannot see C unless you are at B?
No, I'm just stopping at the truth of any rational process. The truth of it is seen by something which is itself not rational, which is spontaneous.
It's a relative connectivity.
It is a more a seeing consciousness, an intuitive consciousness that knows in the act of seeing and itself does not have a rational process. This is the point I'm making.
But it would be like in the genes when you see a father, son, and a
Right.
grandfather. So you see it. You see
Yes,
some
exactly.
kind of
Yes.
genealogy there. You can see the similarity. So that's a proof.
Yes.
But in other things, it would be just a connectivity of the reality.
Yes.
But that power is in everybody, isn't it?
It's in everybody. That's the
Then
point.
why some people see it and some don't
So,
see it?
okay, that's the interesting thing. The power behind which makes possible the mind's working is there in everybody. And some people seem to be able to see quickly, some people don't seem to see quickly, but eventually everybody sees.
It's the
And what's the
intuition.
difference?
That's the intuition. Some
Yes,
people have
yes,
it, some
exactly.
people don't.
No, everybody has it.
So there is nothing to be developed, it is already there.
Exactly. There's nothing to be developed, it's there already. That power is there and it's not a thinking mind.
It is your connection.
It makes possible a thinking mind. Now, here's the interesting part. Sometimes you can't see it. And why? Because you're lost in the thought process so much that this thing which sees behind is not allowed to reflect into the thinking process, is not allowed to guide your thinking process. And when you make your mind quiet, suddenly it reflects and you catch it. I got it now. Yes.
Isn't that the psychic being?
Okay, isn't that the psychic being? At this point, we cannot say it's the psychic being, but we can say the psychic being has this capacity of seeing true. Okay? But all seeing true is not psychic being. The psychic being belongs to a domain where the true seeing is natural. But at the first layer in what we're describing is still a consciousness in the mind, but standing behind the rational operations. which makes possible the rational operation. In fact, it defines how your mind works because of what it sees. Mind of our mind. You see how the term begins to make much more sense. But it doesn't stop here. You can go a little deeper and a little deeper. And I will not right now go too deep. Yes.
So rather than intuition, I feel that the society influences what we think is what's rational and what's not rational. So if a person who has no connectivity to society, or if is like grown in the wild,
so
nothing would be.
We could assume, but that's a proposition you make, that perhaps this is just part of our conditioning. But we notice animals have the same capacity. To a degree, they can rationalize the situation, make sense of it in a certain way. Okay? And interestingly, newborn babies can do it before they have been conditioned by society and human experience. There's a very interesting experiment that against a blank wall, you fix an object as if it is floating. And when a newborn baby is shown this, a floating object, he looks at it, stares, looks around you, and then starts crying because he doesn't see a support. Something inside at the back of the mind, the frontal mind is not yet formed, but this thing behind knows this is weird, this is not normal. And he doesn't know how to express it, he starts crying. And this is true of all of us. Especially if you remember how you were in your young age, you'll recall you knew things, but you didn't know how to express them. But you knew them not by thinking out, but by kind of spontaneous seeing.
But aren't those the instincts rather than the intuitions?
So this part of the mind, you may use the word instinct if you like, I don't mind what you call it. This part of the mind sees without needing to think. If you call it instinctive, fine. You call it intuitive, fine. But there's a difference between the two.
But is it true that psyche can be developed and intuition is just?
Well, so first you recognize this part already exists. What can be developed is your capacity to access this seeing.
So there's a difference.
But the seeing itself doesn't need development.
Yeah,
Is
there's
there?
a difference between intuition and psychic development. So when you say something that you develop psychically, it's a stages of development. Where intuition just kind of is like, all of a sudden you get it.
So the capacity to get it intuitively all of a sudden can be developed.
Yeah, can be developed.
Yes, I'll show you how. Right now, what's preventing you from seeing true directly is the activity of the mind, which is lost in chasing. So I give you a puzzle. You have a newspaper puzzle and you're thinking, what is this? A crossword puzzle. Which word could it be? And you're trying this word, that word, that word, that word. That's the normal surface thinking process. You become very quiet. And then the seeing power acts. And click, you get the idea, it's this word. And you know it's right even before you've tried it. Something inside you knows. We call it intuition. Right? But the kicking in of the intuition can take place if you create the conditions necessary for its kicking in. And the first condition required is make your mind quiet. The surface mind, the agitating activity mind.
But we say that some people are very intuitive and the others are not. And some people like just get it very faster. That means to me, it seems like they are more connected to reality.
They are
The objects or whatever.
more naturally open to feeling, listening, this deeper seeing, deeper knowledge. Either by habit, by instinct, or by training, whatever form it takes.
Habit would be one.
Now, one of the things which happens in life, you often get an intuition, but you rationalize it out, and then later you regret, and you look back, I wish I had followed my intuition, but next time when the intuition comes, you pay more attention to it, and over time you learn to value it and to distinguish it from your own thoughts. It has a distinct field when the intuition comes. So that's training you've gone through unconsciously. But I could tell you, okay, let's do a workshop where we will train precisely to become conscious of this in a span of 3 days rather than 3 years of many errors. Either way, it's a training.
But not everybody can be trained for it.
Why not?
Everyone?
Everybody can be trained. Because remember, this power behind is there in everyone.
No, I mean everybody can be trained, but not like so fast or whatever. It depends on
Doesn't
their
matter.
touch, right?
Fast or slow is irrelevant. Everybody can be trained because the power is behind everybody's mind. In some, it is more intensely active, in some less intensely, but it is there, and you can intensify its action.
Kind of a mental question. What you're describing, are these related to then the different levels of jnana and darshan? The difference between
Yes,
them?
yes. So there are different levels of perception, different levels of accessing knowledge. But the point I was getting at is to show that there is in our minds functioning a layer behind which makes possible the mind's functioning. That's already getting you a clue that there's a whole thing of which we're not conscious, but which is the cause of our conscious power of thought. Mind of our mind. And Sri Aurobindo shows how this power, which is at the origin of the mind's capacity, is the supramental consciousness. Supermind is mind of our mind. And the relationship between the two, he shows. Where mind is struggling to get by chasing pieces and forms and experimenting, trying to fit them, missing, hitting somehow by chance, that consciousness behind already grasps what mind is chasing after. And it expresses spontaneously what it already has. And the two, mind and supermind, are almost as if opposite in their working. Where mind functions in pieces and joining and breaking pieces, supermind holds the unity of all things. Where mind is in movement, looking for, supermind already holds and freely expresses what it holds. Where mind is struggling to gain mastery, supermind already has mastery and expresses its lordship spontaneously. And so they are literally opposite to each other, and yet one is the cause of the other. You could not have a rational functioning mind if there was not this power of supermind seeing the truth in the right relation behind, constantly, spontaneously.
I do not know which direction you're going to go next, but Sri Aurobindo takes it further, the functioning of the mind in terms of vijnana, prajnana, and all the other modes of
Yes.
accessing things and interpreting it. I do not know whether it would be in that direction or somewhere else.
So I will not go further into technicality because we're dealing with a more important idea which needs to be covered. In the same way, in the domain of our senses, there is something which is sight of our sight and hearing of our hearing. So when you look at the world before you, what's actually happening inside your eyes? The light from all things is falling on the retina. The retina itself is made up of so many cells, dots, which are all sending electrical signals all the way to the brain. And then something happens miraculously. In the textbook of biology, it will say, and the brain sees magically. Thank you. In the old days, they say, the eye sees. Now they say, no, the eye does not see, eye only transmits to the brain sees, okay? And how does the brain see? We don't know, we're just still exploring that. But somehow it seems. And the problem is, we don't know how that somehow happens. Yes.
Our question is, we have all this knowledge in ourselves. What is dementia and why do so many people lose what they have and can't think anymore? How can it be prevented?
It's an important question, so we will pause this discussion on sight and come back to the mind of our mind. What is the cause of dementia? She's asked. If this thing is already there behind. In certain kinds of illness, the normal functioning and right relation between this seeing consciousness behind and the maintaining thinking consciousness in front, that right relation, natural relation is disturbed. For example, if there's a fog, the sunlight is still coming through the fog, but you don't see clearly anymore. And if the fog is wandering, you see glimpses which get covered up and then glimpses which get covered up and you never see the whole picture. Although the sunlight still illumines the fog, you do not see, right? Something like that happens in the mind. In the functioning, especially of the physical part of the brain, there's a subtler part of the brain also, but in the physical part of the brain, you could, for example, inject certain chemicals which makes the neurons work less efficiently, communicate less efficiently, and the result will be some kind of clouding. But where? In the surface part of the mind. The thing behind still sees true and clear. And this is the reason why people who have dementia or some other kind of damage to the thinking power, in sleep state, in dream state, they think clearly because they're disconnected from the physical brain and can function normally in the subtle body. The moment they reconnect with the physical brain, it's like a fog comes upon the thinking process again, and they can't see true. The light of the seeing consciousness behind does not reach the surface functions of the thinking mind. If by some kind of a yogic training they could disengage from the surface thinking mind and slide into that consciousness behind, they would see. Whether they would be able to express is a different story. It depends again on the brain, but they would be able to see at least. It's similar to what happens when, in certain conditions, a person is unconscious, when they are, what's the word used? In a coma. And there is a few cases where a person after 30 years in coma woke up suddenly and then said, I could hear everything, but I couldn't move, I couldn't express myself. So the registering consciousness is fully functional, the articulating consciousness is blocked. Speech of our speech. I want to express, but I'm unable to express when the surface machinery is damaged. But the consciousness that can express is behind. It's the source of the expression of our own speech. That is still functioning because it's free of the biological damage. We come back to sight of our sight. So you're seeing this electrical signals going to your brain, and suddenly, magically, I see. So in artificial intelligence, we try to create circuits which are able to see. And when they look at the scene, they should be able to distinguish that is a flower, that is a leaf, that is table. And how do we do that? We show the circuit many examples and say, this is it, this is it, this is it, and it somehow learns to categorize. But we didn't do that as children. As a baby, we looked at it, and it was obvious this was different, that was different. Where did this faculty come from? Our brain never got a chance to train itself the way we train artificial intelligence, deep learning neural networks. Where did that come from? There's something in the consciousness which sees, and then that seeing reflects in the working mind and the working senses as, this I call flower. So as we grew up from childhood, we developed a vocabulary to describe what we were seeing and what we knew. But the seeing and the knowing was taking place already behind at a level which we are not conscious of. The one who recognizes flowerness and flower itself is behind the senses. So you're listening to music, and if you observe the wave of sound, the sound wave on the computer screen, it goes complete chaotic fluctuations. That's getting into your ear, converted by another machinery, goes to the brain, and somehow the brain hears. Hello, when you hear it, I can hear the violin, I can hear the trumpet, I can hear the human voice, and I can distinguish all of them. Where did the brain learn to do that? It never had a training of a deep neural network that Google is working on, which needs months to train before it can learn to recognize basic shapes. Who trained it? Something behind already could see and distinguish, and the physical hearing sound coming in was just a focal point for its attention to get to the thing itself. And so the Kena Upanishad describes hearing of our hearing, sight of our sight, as something which is taking place in a consciousness behind, not formed of our biology, not formed of thinking mind, but in its origin it is essentially Brahman. Know that to be Brahman and not this which men follow after here. The conclusion in all this though is all of our human life processes, key processes, are supported by something else which is in a consciousness of oneness, which has all those powers, and a reflection of those powers in the organized biology and mind is what makes for our human experience. But between that and this experience is a continuity of all these. power of thought, sight, hearing, life energy, creative expression, and speech. And all belong to a divine consciousness of oneness. Which means, in principle, we can shift the state of our consciousness all the way until we awaken fully into that and live in that oneness. And from that oneness, exercise the biology and the machinery of our mind. In principle. Should be possible, right? And so the Kena actually gives you something very practical. In showing this continuity, it prepares us for an ascent into a higher consciousness of a divine character, and from there, therefore, a divine life, and a divine hearing, and a divine sight, and a divine speech, and a divine formation of thought. How does that work? The divine thought is not thought out, but sees and formulates. Divine speech is not struggling to find the right words. It knows already in a creative expression and flows into formation. A divine seeing sees not only what our physical sight can see, but much more than it can see. Has it ever happened to you that trying to get a good example, something which you've seen normally, ordinarily for years, but never really noticed properly. And then somebody says, "Oh, do you know?" and gives a long explanation of how important this is. And suddenly you're looking at the same thing with new eyes. Suddenly it has so much deeper and a richer meaning. We have experiences like that in life. What changed? The physical sight was exactly the same, but the inner seeing now is much more deep, much more complete. And so as we ascend into this high consciousness, even our senses open out. And when we see an object, we see not just this object, but so much more that this represents, that this expresses, and so on. So this is a very important idea of the sense of continuity from human life to divine life, and therefore the possibility of an ascent into a divine life. So I think I'll pause here because we are approaching our time. Behind all this was, the intention was to place before you the concept of the supermind as it was articulated in the Veda and the early Upanishads, and Sri Aurobindo's own expression of that in his commentaries and their correspondence with his own experiences, to show that the supermind is not some newfangled invention of Sri Aurobindo. It is a reality of the cosmos which not only makes rational sense, but which was seen by all the ancient rishis, described and articulated in words which correspond exactly to what Sri Aurobindo says. But there's one difference from the Vedic experience to the approach of Sri Aurobindo's yoga. In the Vedic experience, because remember, it was a stage in evolution. The rishis reached the supermind, even brought down the supramental consciousness into the mind, and the mind itself was illumined and suffused with the supramental light and saw differently. But the body itself was left as the wick supporting the flame. You know, the flame is not physical almost. It is light itself, substance of light, glowing, radiating. But the wick is not light, but is the base on which the light can stand. You remove the wick and then the light doesn't have a physical base. It dissipates. But the wick provides the support. And in the Vedic experience, the human body was such a support base for a divinized mind, which rested on the body. But the body itself did not participate. It was a stage in evolution. That much had to be achieved before one could think of another step. And Sri Aurobindo now articulates this step. He says, not only mind can be transformed into a supramental consciousness, but our life energies, vitality, prana, life force, and even our body and substance of the body. Wow, is that possible? There are people who actually question it. There are yogis, Sri Aurobindo says in one of his letters, who are watching this experiment with great curiosity, goodwill, but curiosity. Will it work? Let's see. If it is not true, then the physical life can only remain as a domain of suffering or ignorance. It would make sense. Because remember, matter itself is an expression of a formative divine consciousness. And if it could be formed by a divine consciousness, its evolution is not complete. It can be reformed and transformed by the divine consciousness until it can express the divinity also. In principle, there's no reason why it cannot happen. And this is the point Sri Aurobindo makes. However difficult it is, even the body, the physical material substance of our being must share in the spiritual experience and itself must become divinized to be able to manifest that. Now we will be discussing this later again when we speak of the mother's experiments and the cellular transformation. But one of the ways in which this can be seen is the body itself, when it becomes conscious and divinized, the cells will function differently. Just as our sight functions differently, our mind functions differently. When awakened to its reality behind, the cells also, instead of being instinctive, habitual, can awaken to their divine reality and begin to express that. And in that, a perfect harmony, a perfect ability to regenerate, and even their functioning will undergo a different arrangement. So we'll be discussing that later. But this concept is unique and new in the history, in the spiritual history of the world. There have been many traditions which have glimpsed a spiritual body, a divine body, a rainbow body in some of the Buddhist traditions. In the Christian tradition, similarly, there is a similar concept. I don't remember the word exactly. But they glimpsed that, but they always saw it as something non-material. But Sri Aurobindo affirms that this must be manifested all the way down to the material consciousness. The human body itself participate fully in the divine manifestation. And this is something new from the Vedic experience. So I will pause here and we can take up any questions. We have about 10 minutes, I think. 8 minutes. Yes.
Just like in the morning, you explain the gradations and the continuation of the consciousness all the way, or mind. Would you be covering also the involution or evolution of the material universe, like Akash, Vayu, Prithvi, how it originated?
It would be a little too technical. We can discuss separately. That would be too technical for the general group. But it's an interesting theme, very important.
But that's how we are connected.
Yes, absolutely. How his question was whether we will discuss how this whole material world forms out of that. It's a fascinating description also. So beautifully described by Sri Aurobindo. In the traditions, you will find it described in suggestive symbolic formulations, but when you read it, you go, oh, what do they mean by that? Because it's a different mind which is articulating in its natural way. To the rational mind, you need to have the explicit steps stated and put in a rational structure. And Sri Aurobindo actually does that, which makes it so obvious and simple.
In the morning session, you explained about aspiration, rejection, and complete surrender. My question is, what are the negative forces acting as a rejection, and how one can overcome those forces that comes in the way of aspiration?
The question is what comes, and he uses the word negative forces, comes in the way of rejection, and how that can be overcome by aspiration. If you go to the essence of it, the only thing that prevents you from getting free of the past tendencies, the rejection process, is habit. That's the only thing preventing you. Even if there is something from outside which seeks to enter you to provoke anger, it can get in because there is something in you which has the tendency for anger by habit. If you knock that out completely, the force from outside would not get a foothold. I'll give you an example. There's a very interesting study done on dolphins. And during a certain period, the military in the US was trying to use dolphins as tools to do stuff for them. So they were interested in seeing how far this could be taken. So in one of the experiments, they opened the brain of the dolphin, it was alive, and they triggered, by touching electrodes to different parts of the brain, they triggered emotions. And when they triggered anger, the dolphin got angry, and then it got surprised that it was angry, and then it willed itself out of anger and refused to get angry. And they continued to stimulate the anger center, it wouldn't get angry. Wow, that's more sophisticated than a human being. Oh, you made me angry once again. I had decided not to get angry. See, you spoiled my. You made me angry.
With karma, with objects that they kind of come, obstacles that
You know,
come in rejection.
Karma is only a ripple of energies. You push and there's a ripple which returns to you. But at the end of the day, you are the creator of your own karma. You can modify that. But here the problem is more of getting free from a tendency which is more habitual, which is entrenched as a habit. And having gone through it so many times, I didn't do it, but the biology which I inherited from my parents has been doing it for so many generations. And so I am kind of trapped in this habitual tendency. But I, who am free of the biology, can assert my freedom on the biology and the psychology and remold it, like the dolphin refuses to get angry after a point. We can do that also. Refuse to get angry, refuse to get upset, refuse to get sad, refuse to get depressed. I'll share with you a very beautiful narration from one of the ashramites. He's now very aged, almost approaching 90. An extraordinary person, very quiet. His name is Dr. D.V. Joshi. He is the head of the laboratory in the ashram. Deep sadhak. And he said to me, at the age of 21, one day I just woke up and I realized that it is my birthright to be happy. And there is nothing in the world which can force me to be unhappy. And I decided I will never be unhappy again. I will always be happy whatever happens. Yes, and he did it. And the truth is, if you think about it, nothing can compel you to be unhappy if you don't want to, if you don't allow that. You can choose freely. And this is the point of humanness, that we can choose and to assert that choice on the machinery of our psychology and biology. Right?
You get up in the morning, you say, I'd rather be happy than right.
Yes.
Very easy.
So to come back to your question, what is the problem in rejection? It is really just a habit. And you can create a counter habit. Create positive habits. Rather than fighting your anger, develop the opposite consciously. The method Mother recommends, rather than fighting the negative, inculcate the positive. And by ignoring the negative, not giving it the chance to grow, it fizzles out on its own. If you start fighting against your own anger, you get more and more frustrated and more and more angry that you got angry. It's a vicious cycle. Yes, please, at the back.
You did mention that we could condition our mind to tap into the intuitive side. So the first thing is that make the surface mind quiet. Is there anything else we can do?
Yes, that's a good question. So how to train our intuition? Sri Aurobindo gives 4 methods of developing or awakening to intuitive consciousness. The first method is training the mind to become quiet at will. To be able to make it quiet whenever you want and to stay in that mental silence for as long as you want. Work on this. If you get this, the rest becomes all very easy. First method. Second method, he says, shift the center of thought to above head. Where's the center of your thinking? Somewhere here. You feel yourself, I am thinking somewhere here. Right? Shift it here. How do you do that? Well, just become conscious. Shift your center. It's as simple as that. It snaps back by habit, but shift it back up and hold it there. So initially you'll find it's a bit tricky. It's like getting the balance while cycling. You hold it here. Maybe you have to keep your eyes closed for a while. And after a while, once it's stable enough, you can open your eyes. But the moment you start doing something, talking, you'll find plop, it drops back. Fine, let's go a little bit more, small steps. After a while, you'll find you can stay here and speak. Very quickly, within a few days, it doesn't take long. Depends on your persistence. And then After a while, you find something is here, but something is there. There's a kind of a split, a double station. But already by then, Sri Aurobindo says, you will be free of brain fatigue. You can study all you want, you can think all you want, you will not get tired in the brain. Because you're free of the brain consciousness just by shifting up here. If you're tired in the brain, can't think because I'm so zoned out in the brain, shift the center and you'll find it becomes clear. In fact, the thinking here is free, light, wide, spontaneous. You don't have to make so much effort. You want to know things, your mind just flows. And the intuitive faculty is more directly in action here. So this is the second exercise. This is the third exercise, which is to wait before you initiate any activity. So let's say you have to give a presentation, you have prepared for it, you wait. And make your mind silent, turn upwards, ask, invoke the intuition. I would put it on a more personal level, invoke the mother's help, invoke her consciousness, and wait for the help to flow through and initiate the activity. So in this way, you put your personal will in alignment with the higher inspiration and let that lead. And so when it initiates, it also leads subsequently, and you are just flowing with it. It uses your capacities freely flowing through. Third method. And a fourth method, which is more complex, you actually amplify, intensify, raise higher and higher all the faculties of your mind until as if they reach a point where they exceed their own limitations and join with a higher intuition. If you've done the first three, the fourth becomes very easy. For those especially who are more living in the mind and developing their mind's capacities, the fourth method becomes more natural. It will only enrich the intuitive consciousness, but the first three are enough to get to it. Even the first step is enough to begin the process. Okay? 4 methods.
So you'll help us today as you end with the first method?
So, unfortunately, we have to stop now. It's 5:30 already. I was thinking for this, maybe, I'm not sure if everybody is interested in that, but for those of you who are interested in going through kind of a guided meditation, we could do that just after dinner. We have about half an hour from 7:30 to 8, if I'm right. Would you like to do that? So only those who are interested. It need not be compulsory for all. What do you think? HP? Okay. So whoever is interested, you can be here. Is that it, right? 7:30 to 8. So the dinner ends at 6:30 to 7:30 is dinner, and 8 o'clock is the presentation. So those who are interested, please be here at 7:30, be 5 minutes before 7:25, so we'll begin exactly on time.
Keep light.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's close with a short concentration. The most important idea, all that we do is possible because of the support of the supermind behind, which is the real life, the real sense, the real thought, the real speech and inspiration of our consciousness.
So pranayama is on first floor. And